evening, everybody, or afternoon or morning, whenever you're watching this. Today, I have with me a man that needs no introduction, Duncan Dobie. He's a former editor of North American Whitetail. He's an author, journalist. He's the author of The Dawn of American Deer Hunting, 1, 2, and soon to be 3. He's also has his new book out right here that I will show you. As you can see, he graciously sent this to me so I could start pre-reading it before we got here. Great read. If you guys can get your hands on this, get it, because it is very interesting. I didn't know at first, but starting to read it, and yeah, it's really cool.
Well, thanks so much. He was an amazing man. Art Rilling was an amazing man.
Amazing, and the fact that you knew him personally, this gentleman.
I was very fortunate. Yeah, well, he had deer, and he had a game park with deer. He was from San Antonio, Texas, originally, and he was in the Marine Corps. Was a veteran of the Korean War, and got transferred right after the Korean War. When he came home, he got transferred to the Atlanta area with his wife. And they had always talked about starting some kind of business. That's what he really wanted to do, his own business. But he wanted to stay in the Marine Corps, and he did for many, many years in the reserves. Mm-hmm. And so about that time, a new park was being developed in Atlanta around Stone Mountain, which is a huge chunk of granite that sticks up out of the ground about 800 feet. And the state had bought that land to make a park. And actually, it was originally intended to be a memorial to the Confederacy.
Yes.
And back in those days, people had a lot of respect for the Confederacy and the war, and so many people had relatives that had fought in the Civil War, and so it was, and so the entire park sort of had a Gone with the Wind type Civil War theme. Mm-hmm. And he was very fortunate. He heard that they were going to start this this park, and they were looking for vendors. So he approached them, and he said, "Hey, I'd like to, get about 10 or 15 acres and have a deer park." And my idea is to have an open area where deer freely roam the premises, and people can walk around on trails and pet the deer and feed them, and the children can walk up to them, and nothing like that had ever been done before with white-tailed deer. And so he did that, and he also had a lot of other animals in the park, but the deer were his mainstay, and everybody just loved it. It was great. So I met him. I was very fortunate to meet him. He's the kind of guy that he's friends with everybody, knows him, and he's friends with everybody. And he allowed me to go in there with his bucks and take pictures of them and study them. And so I spent many years just going in there with some of his big bucks, and it was a great education for me, and I loved it, and we developed a great friendship. So he was an amazing man.
You didn't just have a friendship with him; you had a friendship with a special buck in there.
I sure did, yeah.
And if you could just kind of give a little bit of a teaser on that, because I read that chapter, and it's fascinating.
Well, he had about 15 acres of fenced land in the game park, and he had a lot of animals like bears and bobcats and coyotes in cages also. But the white-tailed deer were they ran freely around. And every September, around the 1st of September, he would put the bucks up. He would take all the bucks and put them in an special enclosure, about a 5-acre enclosure, to keep, because they were starting to get a little aggressive. He didn't want to have any incidents with any of his guests and visitors, and so it was a learning experience, because he had a dart gun that he would use. You have to dart each buck, put them to, tranquilize them, and then get them down and put them on a stretcher and make sure they come around okay. Take them to the new enclosure where they'd probably stay in the new enclosure until they shed their antlers in late winter the following year. And so I started, he would allow, he had a 5-acre enclosure where he had about 10 or 12 bucks. And I was very naive in those days, and he allowed me to go in there with some of those bucks, and some of those bucks were pretty aggressive, and I was very fortunate. But I made friends with one of the dominant bucks, and I named him Big Boy. And he was just a beautiful, mature buck. He didn't have any kind of outstanding rack. He had about a 9 or 10 point rack, and he was probably at the time 4.5, 5.5 years old. And he really liked me for some reason, and I liked him, and we really became friends. And in the summertime when he was in velvet, I did several series of photos of his growing his velvet, growing his antlers series in the spring and summer. And I would go out there in the summertime, and they'd be laying out in the bushes in the woods somewhere, and I'd just go lay with him, sit down, and I would bring treats. I'd bring apples and honeysuckle. So you can imagine being inside an enclosure like that. They ate every leaf that fell on the ground, and so there was no browse for them to eat. And if they could get to any, they loved it. So I would always go cut a bunch of fresh honeysuckle and take it out there and give it to the deer. They loved it. And he was an amazing deer, and he liked people. I found that each one of those mature bucks had his own personality, and some of them liked people, some of them did not like people at all, some of them detested me, and you could tell. And one of the most interesting things I think that happened to me, when you probably remember, maybe back in the 90s or so, when the grunt, snort, wheeze call came out. Yep. And that was the newest, latest call, and everybody was making them, and it really was a very effective call. But it's an aggressive call. When a buck does that, he's ready to fight, and he's ready to declare his territory. And so I was in the enclosure one day taking pictures, and this buck walked by me, and I could tell he was not real happy with me. And he did that grunt, snort, wheeze, and I thought, what the heck is that? I never heard it before. We walked on down the fence line, and I know this really sounds crazy, but Big Boy, my buddy, the friend, he sort of got between that buck and me, and he kept that buck from getting at me by intimidation. He just kind of stood there and looked at him, and the buck wouldn't come over. But I heard that grunt, snort, wheeze, and I thought, man, and he was all bristled out. His hair was sticking out. You could see the whites of his eyes. I knew he was bad, and I didn't stay. I left. I got out of that enclosure, as quick as I could. And then that happened again one more time a month or so later. Another one did that, and by then I started doing some research and realized that the grunt, snort, wheeze was a very aggressive vocalization, and if they do that at you, they're challenging you basically.
Yeah.
And so I was very fortunate. The many times I was in there with those bucks, I never got attacked or anything. So I was very, very fortunate. And like I said, very naive too, because that was probably a bad time. During the peak of the rut, when some of those deer were really rutting and feeling their oats, it was not a real good idea to be in there with them.
Yeah.
But I also spent a lot of time in the summer, and early fall and late spring when they were just starting to grow their antlers. So it taught me so much about deer just watching their behavior.
Yeah. I was going to say it must have been an educational experience too, just to watch the little intricacies of how they did things, as far as their bedding behavior and their feeding, or how they react to different stimulus. That must have been very interesting.
Yeah, it was. And that's why the game ranch was just enormously popular for families and children because everybody loves deer, whether you're a hunter or not. And so people love going out there, seeing the deer and feeding them. But so many hunters went out there, and many, many hunters, I've talked to just dozens of deer hunters in Georgia who went there for the first time and saw a mature buck, and they'd never been 20 feet from a mature buck before. And it was just kind of a life-changing experience to be that close to a mature buck.
Well, yeah, that would be. I've never seen anything. We have the Squam Lake Science Center here in New Hampshire that does have an enclosure with whitetails in it. I remember when we went there. I haven't been there for many years, but they had a buck that had been injured and couldn't be re-released after it had been rehabilitated, and they had it in the enclosure. And he was a fairly large whitetail at the time. And just everybody else wanted to move along and see all the other cute little critters. I just wanted to stay there and watch the deer the whole time. But it's a very interesting in place that we have there. It does help. Any type of place like that that can introduce children to the wild animals and the flora and the fauna of their area, I think is a very important place.
Oh,
So
it is. And thousands and thousands of Georgia children and the Atlanta area children grew up going to the game ranch and seeing the animals and learning a lot about the different animals there. They had everything there. So, but the theme was native animals to Georgia. So most of the animals
yep.
were native to Georgia. So they didn't have exotic animals or anything like that. But quickly, I'll tell you one more thing about Big Boy. Art Rilling had a 20-year lease originally at his game ranch inside Stone Mountain Park. And when the 20 years was up, they would not renew his lease. They led him to believe they were going to renew it. And so he waited till the last minute. And then they told him, like on December 1st, we're not renewing the lease and you got to be out of here by December 31st. So he had 600 animals he had to move. And he had to get a new facility, buy a new piece of land to put the animals on and have a kind of a holding area while he was developing this new piece of land. And so all the deer had to be captured or darted with a dart gun. And I went out several times to help him capture deer. And I got several funny stories. And there one was about a little fawn, a 6-month-old fawn that I had told him he was just hanging around us, and we'd already put like 6 deer in this horse trailer. We were going to take them to the holding area. And I said, well, I can, let's just get that little fawn. I'll just go catch him and put him in the trailer. And Art just kind of folded his arms like that. He says, okay, let me watch this. So I went over there with a little corn and it was a little 6-month-old buck fawn. And he started eating corn out of my hand. And I grabbed his front leg and he started just making all kind of squawking and making all kind of noise. It would have been raining that day and it was kind of muddy and little mud puddles everywhere. And he dragged me about 20 feet across the ground because I was just holding on to him with a death grip. And finally got on top of him. He was kicking. All 4 legs were kicking out. And I finally got on top of him and just held him down with every bit of strength I had. I just had him in a bear hug and I picked him up and I carried him about 30 or 40 feet over to the horse trailer and put him in. And everybody was over there just with Art and his helpers. They were just rolling on the ground laughing because I had a sweater on that was just shredded and from his foot. And it was just so the strength of a deer, even a small deer like that, is of any wild animal. The strength that a wild animal has is just incredible.
Absolutely.
But then one more quick story. Big Boy, my buddy, I went out another day and to help catch a few deer. And so I was talking to Art, and I said, well, have you caught Big Boy yet? And he said, no. He said, we had a little problem with Big Boy. He called him Elroy, and I always called him Big Boy. And we had separate names for him, but he was a very human-friendly buck, so everybody kind of knew him and knew who he was. And so he said, yeah, we had a little problem. He said, we were going to dart him today. I had him on the list. And we got him cornered in a fence corner, and he said he jumped over the 6-foot chain link fence, jumped over and got out. He's gone. And so the whole area was fenced in with a high chain link fence. Actually, it may have been higher than 6 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time he was probably a 5.5-year-old, 200+ pound mature buck. He just jumped over that fence like there was nothing to it, and he was gone. And so we, always wished him the best. There were some wild deer around there at the time outside of the enclosure.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just hope that he, made it out in the wild. I'm sure he did if he didn't get run over by a car.
Yeah, well, he got plenty of browse after that. He could fill his face then, I guess. But yeah, that would be dramatic, especially with a deer that's human friendly to be out in the wild. I mean, did they hunt in that area at that time?
They did, but this particular county is closed to hunting because it's one of the metro Atlanta counties. And so at that time, today they have bow hunting only in that county. But even then, I'm not sure back then that they had bow hunting open during archery season. So there was really no hunting there. And he might have been. There were a lot of subdivisions, homes around there, and he was the kind of deer he would just probably walk up in somebody's backyard and just walk right up to somebody. So who knows? We never
Yeah.
heard any stories about him, but
Huh.
he was a dominant buck, so I'm sure he did pretty well.
Yeah. Well, that I guess once you're wild, you want to be free. So
Oh
away you
yeah,
went.
for sure. And he was. He was. So we wished him the best and hope that he did great.
You also graciously sent another book to me, and which I'm very touched and grateful for. Now, before I bring this up, is this book still in publication?
Oh yeah. Well, I still have quite a few of them, so
All
it
right.
is.
So I'm going to show you guys this book, and Duncan can tell you later on how to get a hold of it, because this book is one of the best ones I read. And there's one story in here that about knocked me on my butt. So if I can quickly find it, we'll be in good shape here. And this is the magic of editing. So let's see. I think it's called A Buck to Remember. Here we go. There it is. A Buck to Remember, Chapter 6. This story in this book, with some great illustrations, as you can see, hit me like a ton of bricks. The story is almost reminiscent of my biggest buck, Odd Job, the one I shot the year before, that I put so much time and effort into patterning and finding and finally getting. And the respect between that deer and me was pretty evident. It's same in this story, especially the end of it where he talks about how he has it almost like an emptiness after he shoots this deer. This book right here, it's Whitetails and Other Hunting Stories, is a fabulous read. So anybody out there can get the hands on this, and I'm sure Duncan can tell you how to do it. Get this book. Just like anything that Duncan writes, it's more than worth reading. So it's just awesome.
Well, thank you very much for that. I grew up reading so many great stories, and some of the great writers like Robert Ruark and The Old Man and the Boy, and I always wanted to write stories like that. And so when I started writing seriously about whitetail hunting, I started writing a lot of fictional stories, and there are very few writers that do that these days.
Mm-hmm.
And that was actually my second book, and all those stories are fictional. But as you can imagine, most fictional stories are based on some truth or an experience. Like the Buck to Remember is really a real story. It's based on a real story. So, and so many fictional stories really are, something that happened in your life that you saw, you heard a story, you talked to someone that told you a story, and that's how these stories come about. But I've always loved writing just pure fiction, making stuff up, and I guess I'm one of the few writers in the country that's ever done that, because I've done several books on collections of deer hunting stories like that, and I just love writing those kind of stories.
It's great. There's another story, and then I can't remember it offhand, but it's about the little boy who has basically a pretty rough family, and he finds the sheds. And when his dad asks him where he found him, because it was some buck everybody was after, he told him the spot completely different or where he had actually found them, which that actually strikes home too, because I may or may not have done that to certain people just to keep a secret, So the book is great. Everybody out there who reads it's going to have a story in there that really connects with them, without a doubt. So,
well, thank you so much for mentioning that.
It's a great book. Another thing, and I know I'm chomping at the bit for the next installment of Dawn of American Deer Hunter. When is the projected release date of that book?
They are telling me now around August.
So that'll be great.
It'll be probably late August or early fall, but it'll be August, September.
Yeah,
for sure.
Just in time to start buying.
They're just starting to their design artist is just starting to lay out the chapters now.
Mm-hmm. That's going to be great, because the timing of it will be great for Christmas. It'll be just before deer season
will
when
be good for
everybody's thinking
Christmas.
of it.
Yeah, so
So
I'm excited. I'm excited. I think it's got so much good stuff in it, and as you and I talked about last time, I'm you know I'm a I guess I'm a dinosaur because I love all the old stuff, and I love looking at all the old photos and seeing how these guys hunted back in those days, and the rifles they used, and the methods they used, and I've always been intrigued with that so much, and so I love getting those photos and doing the stories, and trying to dig into them a little bit,
mm,
and find out where some of these people were from, like your grandfather, and who's going to be in the book, and I'm very
yeah,
excited about that. And there's just so many great hunters from New England, from the Adirondacks, and you know you just can't beat that area. And like you mentioned, there seems to be a lot of emphasis on hunting in the Midwest because that's where all these big deer are coming from. That's where a lot of big deer are coming from, not all, and everybody wants to hunt the Midwestern states, but there's so much great hunting in so many other places, and especially in New England, um, New York State, Pennsylvania,
mm,
and you go right down the eastern seaboard, Virginia and the Carolinas into Georgia, and then across to Texas. There are just so many great places
mm.
to hunt beside the Midwest. And in Dawn of American Deer Hunting, I always try to cover as many states as I can, but it's very difficult getting photos from some of the like southern states because back in the old days they just didn't take many photos.
Right.
So
Yeah, it seems to be there's a wealth of it here in New England. Speaking of old stuff, I'm going to kind of mention a friend of mine. I taught a shed hunting workshop today, kind of a private one with two guys. And the guy that hosted it at his home is a man named Thad Goodwin. And he's becoming a really good friend. And he wanted to show me this rifle. So we went down in the basement and he pulled up this rifle. And I near had a heart attack. It's a Model 94. We ran the numbers for him. It's from 1905. And what makes this very interesting in the Northeast is it's a Western carbine with the saddle ring. It has the welded front sight on it instead of like one of mine has the dovetailed front sight. And this was his great grandfather's gun, if I recall correctly. And I made a comment that it was very rare to see saddle rings in the Northeast that far back. Generally, they were out west. And he said, well, he was from out west. They have pictures at the deer camp that he has in up here of his grandfather with the guns all stacked together, military style. And you can see the rifle in the picture, but on the meat pole behind him, it's mule deer and not whitetails. So he was very excited to show me that gun, and I was very excited to actually handle the weapon. And it's in pristine shape. I mean, it is really nice. So
yeah, those are beautiful guns, beautiful weapons.
And I told him, I says, Dad, he asked me, how do you feel about me taking this in the woods and firing and killing a deer with it? And I was like, if you didn't, I'd be upset. I mean, those old Model 94s, the pre-64 94s are built like tanks. They'll take abuse. They're mechanically sound. They're just great guns. So I told him I think that he should shoot at least one with it before he puts it on the wall or whatever he's going to do with it. So I would suggest that to anybody to try to do it with one of those older guns like that, because it really gives you a thrill to use that older equipment. I mean, I swear by it. It seems to do me all right.
It's very special to be able to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I still got my grandfather's gun in here that I was going to take with me this year, but we didn't quite get it to the point I wanted to get it. And hopefully next year I can build up some muscle so I can carry that great big tank of a gun and do it, because that 26-inch octagon barrel weighs a ton. So.